I want to talk about something today that is integral to the male psyche, something I've been talking about quite a lot in recent weeks, or at least partially alluded to, and certainly the last discussion I had with the red pill chemist, which is to say the different ways in which men cope and deal with the world as opposed to women. I'm convinced after many years of studying the subject matter that the way men deal best with pain, suffering, particularly of the emotional sort, is the same way they deal with real-world problems, which is to say, maybe there's a problem at a factory that requires the intervention of engineers. Well, the engineers are called in, they have a look, they analyze it, and they come up with a solution. It's not to say that for the realm of intersexual relations that there's always a concrete solution, but effectively what the MGTOW enterprise is, or at least what it's always been to me, and I know a lot of people get annoyed with my understanding of it, is that understanding of human nature. I call this resolution through understanding. For a man, peace of mind is best begotten of that understanding, that comprehension. Now, it's not a cure-all for everything. Men still feel pain, they still suffer, particularly emotionally, but understanding things really is the step towards quote-unquote healing. Now, I want to contrast this, of course, with the way women go about things. Now, we spent a lot of time in the recent discussion talking about metaphor, say the static photograph, the snapshot image, versus the film, which has a finite beginning and end. Women tend to engage in narratives. This is not to say, as some people might accuse me, that men never tell themselves narratives. Virtually all human beings tell themselves narratives, but the kinds of stories they tell themselves to either justify, explain their feelings are rarely, if ever, direct mirrors of reality. Rather, they are the reality that best affirms their egos and allows them to feel good about themselves. It is possible that such a narrative could, in fact, be an accurate reflection of reality. But remember, speaking of mirrors, the world is a mirror reflection of how they feel about themselves. Women are sponges and reflectors of the environment. Not so with men. Men are quite different, and you know this. You can feel it as a man. I'm terrible at telling myself narratives anyway, but I can identify the way I feel at any given moment. In the past, I could identify negative feelings I had in previous dalliances or romantic entanglements, but I never really had a good explanation for why I was feeling things, or I never had a good explanation, better put, for the processes that led me down the road of feeling a certain way. And as a man, as men, we're disinclined to tell ourselves narratives that affirm our subjective feelings just because it makes us feel good. Now, I contend that as an extension of this, we can look at, say, feminism. I mean, a lot has been said about feminism in MGTOW circles and elsewhere. But if you want to talk about a film, that's what feminism is. It's a documentary film, a poorly narrated, poorly documented film, no doubt, one with many flaws, with skewed perspectives, but it is a film of the female mind's view of history. I mean, we've talked about this many, many times. Feminism is, to some large extent, female nature writ large, when you have an industrial, mechanized society, at least. That's a narrative. That's a narrative of how women were treated and how they were dealt with. And that is just something that we can see demonstrably as not being true. But what does this tell us as well? This tells us, in this feminized society we live in, that the tools of explanation are the tools of storytelling. The tools of storytelling that give us a subjective impression of things, that perhaps, in the best case scenario, might reflect proximate causes, give you proximate explanations, best case scenario, and more often than not are based on the whims and fancies of a given person. We have, it said, a feminized society, and I would agree to a large extent, gynocentric, however you want to term it, but this methodology of explaining things, of achieving resolution, for yourself as an individual and dealing with feelings and the world is a feminine model. Getting together and just talking, I mean, that's the quintessential feminine activity. Swapping stories about how you feel, rather than actual models of how things are. That is the world we live in. I mean, you'll get these sort of science is cool tidbits every now and then, but by and large, the model is the feminized narrative, the subjective storytelling, the film. And there's a reason why men in modernity in recent decades, many reasons, but there's a good reason for this, why they just feel so out of touch with the society they live in. Yes, it's a feminized society. Yes, it's gynocentric. But the methodology offered to men to explain how they feel about themselves in the world is one that only works well for women, frankly speaking. I could, spend all day writing a story, telling a story to myself in my own mind, crafting a story about what happened with some ex, or observing some, marriage or what have you. And at the end of the day, it doesn't do very much for men. Instead, men are told to, get back in the saddle and try again and again. And they keep on going in blindly. And I view very much the original efforts of MGTOW back in the day as that first step, as an enterprise, towards a male method and means of coping with things and resolving issues, internal issues, which is to say, understanding. The title, Intellego, Viri, which is I understand the way of the man, or man's way, tells it all. I think many men who've been involved peripherally or listened to MGTOW content realize that one of the key aspects to getting over some of these issues that men have faced throughout their lives, whatever their age group, is understanding the intersexual dynamic between men and women, which is based upon a lot of things. It is heavily based on distal causes, a shared yet highly differentiated evolution that develops side by side, but also on proximate causes. I mean, for example, a girl without a father or a stepfather who's distant might act in a different way to a quote-unquote loving, a girl who had a loving father. Just as an example. That would be a proximate cause of explanation for certain types of behavior. But generally speaking, we rely on evolutionary psychology and biology to explain things. Now, there's always a lot of resistance to this. We've seen it time and again. It never stops. Just like the feminists, just like this. Now, the huge difference here is that whilst feminism is a tall tale, a film narrated particularly poorly by a bunch of women, evolutionary psychology and biology has real scientific evidence. We know that we're a sexually dimorphic species. We know, for example, that a consequence of sexual dimorphism is differentiated behaviors, because your physical impact on the world would also be different in that case. And as a consequence, of course, your behavior and how you interact with others would be different. These are things that are known and acknowledged even in mainstream academia, at least to some extent, although feminism is paid lip service. But that understanding, I think, is key to feeling better about certain situations. The man who's gone through a horrific divorce because he thought he was doing quote-unquote the right thing when his wife ended up cheating on him when he was working his 60-hour work week, and he came home too tired to bother with anything but playing video games and just chilling out, barely had time to spend with his children. The wife cheating on him, feeling justified because she felt neglected, and her taking the house and the kids. I mean, a blue pill understanding, a subjective story he can tell himself. Well, he has a subjective story. What is the traditional blue pill subjective story men tell themselves when they are involved in relationships or marriages and feel betrayed or cheating occurs or what have you? It's, I did everything right. I cared for her. I took care of her. I provided for her. Blah, 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 blah. That seems to be the correct course of action. That's what you're told to do by society at large, right? But that tells you a fraction of the story. Yes, you effectively did a job, but there are other elements to the job when it comes to the intersectional relationship that exists between men and women. I mean, you fulfilled a role. I spoke fairly recently of compartmentalization. Yes, you were the workhorse provider. The workhorse provider, though, that role as a man, does not provide the women with emotional comfort and satisfaction. You're merely giving her the goods that she requires for continued existence and for the existence of her offspring. And as a consequence, she will seek those resources, those emotional resources, and indeed in many cases sexual and emotional resources elsewhere. So the narrative is one you already know, the blue pill narrative, that sort of subjective film. I was the star of the film, I was the workhorse provider, but that doesn't tell the whole story. It's this kind of understanding, based upon a firm and detailed understanding of female psychology, that allows men in general to overcome some of these limitations and actually feel better about themselves. The man, for example, who's been, love bombed or idealized by some version of a female, it feels great. When he's dropped out of the plane at 30,000 feet without a parachute, when she withdraws and moves on to her next subjective film, well, he's in for a rough ride, to say the least, and the impact is going to be pretty heavy and pretty painful. However, if he understands that this is an element of manipulation, psychology, however you want to term it, after a while, this understanding will set in, and he will feel better about himself. He won't be lost at sea. And this is the problem. Men, generally speaking, when it comes to their feelings, as if men had feelings, of course they do, they're very bad at telling themselves these narratives, these stories of concocting films. Men don't see themselves as part of a film, by and large. Maybe some narcissistic men do, but your average male does not. Static images that are connected to each other in a linear fashion. And of course, that framework also lends itself to a more fact-based understanding, an understanding based on evidence. That's what went on. The man who grasps these red pill concepts says, that's what went on in my marriage. This explains it. Now, does that necessarily eradicate the pain he feels, the sense of betrayal, the sorrow, the suffering? Probably not. But in time it will, because he will remove himself from the situation and view himself as, in this context, essentially the role he played in this particular female's film. He was the workhorse provider. He was that prop. And she has another prop on the side doing something else. I'm convinced that this is one of the great mistakes that are consistently made in society these days. When people say we live in a feminized society, they never touch upon this, but our understanding of the world these days, increasingly, as we are detached from the historic and prehistoric environment that gave rise to us as a species, it's so detached from that we become naturally more inclined to tell ourselves narratives, fictive narratives that don't map onto reality. But what the man craves is an understanding of reality. Men create things, they build things, they seek to understand, they have to. They fix things, they solve problems. Men are problem solvers. But you can't solve a problem if your life is a film, if it's based on a narrative that may or may not have to do with facts and numbers and data. That's why MGTOW is so essential, ultimately, in this context. It is a counter to a gynocentric society, but it's also a counter to a feminized way of coping with reality and a feminized way of understanding one's feelings. For a woman, it's generally speaking sufficient just to tell yourself a narrative about some subjective feeling you have, a story, and you feel better about yourself. It doesn't seem to work well for men. Certainly it's never worked well for me, and of the, perhaps by now, hundreds of men I've talked to throughout the years, it's not worked particularly well for them either. But for some reason, and I'm saying that a bit facetiously, it's not just for some reason, the attempt at understanding the sexual dynamic between men and women from a scientific perspective, and yes, also, although we're accused of going about this the wrong way, the lived experiences of men, and integrating that combination of anecdotal evidence with the evidence that we do have from observable science, biology, evolutionary psychology. This allows us to transcend these problems to a certain extent, and eventually, I think, overcome them. In some sense, it's cold comfort. No amount of understanding will allow you to replicate the alien and foreign nature of, for example, female tail spinning, the narratives they tell themselves, the subjective eye, as it were, this star and audience of the film at the same time, this sort of thing. It's just alien to most men. But it will give you a perspective that allows you to comprehend where they're operating from and how they operate. And eventually I think this can be beneficial down the line in the long run. I'm not sure how much longer the feminized understanding of the world will be satisfactory to most men. I think in time, maybe long after I'm dead, things will change. If only for the reason that men crave understanding as a resolution to problems, all sorts of problems. And this includes emotional problems and the problems that have their genesis in the, unfortunately, conflicted sexual dynamic that exists between men and women. It's not good enough to tell ourselves a story. We're very bad at spinning those kinds of tales, at least to ourselves. Men want to understand, they want to solve things, fix things. And that can't be done in a film, because a film has a finite beginning and an end, and a film is always fictional, no matter how accurate it might attempt to duplicate the reality it claims it's duplicating. Gentlemen, thanks for tuning in. I will check you out later, and I suppose Happy New Year, if you believe in all that garbage. As always, may the gods watch over you. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.